Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. And today I'm not doing the live stream recording. I'm just doing a straight up recording of the episode. Before we get into anything, by all means, please hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button, make sure to click the bell so that you'll be notified whenever I jump on YouTube. And also, share the content. As soon as you see it come up on social media and stuff, wherever you follow us, share it. Let people hear it and have discussions amongst yourselves. By all means, have discussions with me about the readings, about whatever the content I'm providing each episode. I'd like to hear from you guys. I'd like to know that people are actually listening. Right? Also, you can donate to the show via Cash App. It's $BitterMeds, BITTERMEDZ, BitterMeds. Make sure you donate to the show, or you could specifically request that the donation goes to the curriculum that we're trying to establish. All right, we need your help. We need manpower. We need monetary help. So however you can help will be great. Today, I want to talk about Jacques Garvey. And, recently I did this episode where I talked about how, to kind of cultivate consciousness amongst Black women. And it made me think about Marcus Garvey's ex-wife. Actually, I think his wife upon his death, right? Garvey did something interesting. He married two women named Amy, which is crazy, right? But I wanted to discuss her a little bit, and there's a paper that I'm going to read today called "Always Leading Our Men in Service and Sacrifice." Jacques Garvey, Feminist Black Nationalist. I'm curious to see how this paper goes because they intentionally use the terminology feminist, right? It's papers by Karen S. ADLER from Brandeis University. So let's begin, right? This article focuses on the most important woman in Garveyism, Jacques Garvey, Marcus Garvey's second wife. Jacques Garvey's true value in the Garvey movement has rarely been acknowledged. Most authors and scholars have misleadingly depicted her as Marcus's helpmate. This article proposes that Jacques Garvey was a key architect of Garveyism and a lifelong advocate of social justice in her own right. The author also examines the relationship amongst race, class, and gender as it pertains to Jacques Garvey's life and social thought. All right. So we begin. Marcus Garvey is the universally acknowledged founder and leader of the Garvey movement, the most powerful Black nationalist movement ever established in the United States. Many works have been written about Marcus Garvey as a Black genius and hero. Very little has been written, however, about the most important woman in Garveyism, Marcus Garvey's second wife, Jacques Garvey. While she never held an official title in the U.N.I.A., Amy was a daunting intellectual, orator, writer, social activist, and leader. Her value, nonetheless, has never been fully recognized. The references to her meager. Although Theodore G. Vincent, author of Black Power and the Garvey Movement, wrote that the life and works of Amy Jacques Garvey deserve attention from students of both women's liberation and black nationalism, few scholars have heeded this claim. And that's one of my first questions I'm going to ask you guys listen. Hopefully there's some women listening, because once you see the title is about Amy Jacques Garvey, I would hope that female listeners would jump on this one. Just like I hope female listeners would have jumped on the previous episode discussing cultivating consciousness amongst black women, right? Cultivating consciousness and black nationalism amongst black women. And my question to you guys, and this is for men and women, but I really wanted to hear from the women on this one. How much have you studied Amy Jacques Garvey? Like, most conscious fellas, right, are familiar, if not well-versed in Garvey. But I'd like to know, how much have you sought out, how much have you women, how much have you sought out to understand, and to know, right, to study the second wife, Amy Jacques Garvey? Make sure to put your responses down in the comment section. Most writers on Garveyism focus exclusively on Marcus, reducing Amy to the role of helpmate. Like many women with famous mates, Amy Jacques Garvey was an extraordinary woman whose accomplishments were subsumed by those of her husband. Marcus was cognizant of Amy's invaluable talents and co-opted them for his work. This leads one to entertain the idea that Garveyism was a joint venture, not the singular efforts of one man. What are your thoughts on that statement right there? Is that a feminist thought, or do you think that's fact? In this article, I explore the life and works of Amy. I'm just going to say Amy Garvey. We know it's the second wife, all right? The life and works of Amy Garvey. Through analyzing her participation in the Garvey movement, her life with and without Marcus, her thought, her writing, and her activities after Marcus's death, I highlight her role as a powerful intellectual who made distinctive contributions to Garveyism, and as an outspoken social activist whose lifelong commitment to social change extended far beyond her relationship with Marcus. I show how the interacting forces of race, class, and gender shaped Amy Garvey's life and informed her philosophy of social change. The ostensible contradiction between Amy's conventional private life and her radical public agenda is also analyzed. Methods. A lot of times in these types of papers, you don't see methods so much, but okay. Well, there's an analysis, so I guess you have to have methods. Amy Garvey's book, Garvey and Garveyism, is ostensibly about Marcus Garvey and Garveyism, but it is as much about her life with and feelings towards Marcus. So, Onita Say from the pro-black perspective on KWAZ Radio, one of our sister shows, he actually read, I don't think he read the entire book, but I think he read significant portions of the book on a recent podcast, and he definitely discussed it on his Twitter, some parts of it. And I would suggest you guys go and take a listen to what his commentary was about the book. This book is also a rich source of biographical information on Amy Garvey. Few authors, however, have made use of this material. This research is based primarily on Amy Garvey's primary documents. She edited the Woman's Page in the Negro World for 3 years. Her editorials have a distinctive theory and program for social change that demonstrate a sophisticated womanist consciousness. For this reason, I analyze her writings in the Negro world rather than her later works on black nationalism. Interesting. So Garveyism and the Garvey movement. This is a section. At its peak in the early 1920s, the Garvey movement and its political arm, the U.N.I.A., represented the most powerful organization of black people in the world. Founded in 1914, the U.N.I.A. had, by the early 1920s, over 800 chapters in 40 countries on 4 continents. It maintained nearly 1 million official members and an estimated 2 to 3 times as many people participated in its activities. To this day, the U.N.I.A. remains the largest black organization ever developed in the United States. And that's something I would like to hear from you guys, right? When you consider, and I've talked about this before, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. When you consider this age of information that we're in, how is it not possible that no one can organize on this level? Is it because the age of information has too many distractions? Right? And back in the day, back in 1914, let's face it, there wasn't much for you to really do. Right? Compared to now, of course. Right? You had a radio, and pretty much it. A newspaper. So was it because, there was less going on, so to speak, in terms of distractions? And that's why so many people, or was it because, and I tend to think it was this more than anything. 1914 is not that far off from slavery, from emancipation, right? And so was it because, young people in 1914 had grandparents who were probably like late years slaves? So was it because the people were so close to slavery and going through Jim Crow and didn't have, so it's probably, it's likely all of these things all together, right? And didn't have so many distractions at the time, a kind of a simpler life in terms of living, but a dangerous life at that, and that also reinforced why black folks kind of like was about it. So I'd like to hear your guys' comments about this idea. Highly complex, Garveyism is comprehensive, philosophical, and political program espousing the worldwide liberation of all descendants of black Africa. This freedom is supposed to be achieved through self-help and self-sufficiency in all spheres of life. The Universal Negro Improvement Association teaches our race self-help and self-reliance, not only in one essential, but in all those things which contribute to human happiness and well-being. Right? And that's a fundamental understanding that I don't think a lot of black people have. That it's been, one of my preaching points on this podcast. Right, that you gotta solve your problem. There's a wealth gap, and it's due to slavery. We get it, but the people who enslaved you aren't going to close the wealth gap. So what do you got to do? Group economics, and be real steadfast about it too, right? And it has to be, it really has to be Pan-African, right? And which is what Garvey was trying to do. But this sitting around complaining about, white folks ain't doing this and they did it for other folks. That's what they did for other folks. You have to change your situation, right? You have to be self-reliant. By teaching blacks to be proud of their African heritage and to establish their own separate society in Africa ultimately, the movement's ideology laid the basis for every black power movement in the United States in this century. And this paper was written in the previous century, right? Unlike most black movements, Garveyism derived its strength primarily from the black urban working class and thus had truly revolutionary potential. You can't expect the bourgeoisie suck-ups to be revolutionary, right? By undermining the pervasive acceptance of black dependence on white society and exposing the true depth of black rage, the movement posed a severe threat to white bourgeoisie society. Garveyism rebuked the intellectualism and popular integrationist stance of the black intelligentsia led by W.E.B. Du Bois without foregoing intellectualism. So I'm glad she put that there because for a second I thought I was going to have to do some explaining here. Garvey was not anti-intellectual. This fact is underscored through the example of Amy Garvey. Amy Jacques Garvey in literature. The few references to Amy Garvey in the literature on Garveyism describe her as the nurturing spouse and companion of Marcus Garvey. For example, in The World of Marcus Garvey, Judith Stein in 1986 claims that Amy's marriage to Marcus was successful, unlike his first marriage, because Amy Jacques chose to invest her strength and talents in her husband's career. She defined her role as Garvey's comforter and surrogate, whereas Amy Ashwood had viewed herself more as an equal. While Stein acknowledges that Amy played an active part in the movement when Marcus was away on tour and in prison, it was as Marcus's surrogate, even after his death. Similarly, in Marcus Garvey, Hero by Tony Martin, 1983, one of the foremost scholars on Garvey and Garveyism also describes Amy as the perfect spouse for someone in Marcus's position. While Martin offhandedly claims that Amy, in reality a prolific writer, tried her hand at writing essays and short stories, he also mentions casually that she was the second woman and 10th person to be awarded the Jamaica Institute's Musgrave Gold Medal in December 1971. Amy was awarded this medal for her dedicated and distinguished contribution to the history of the people of African descent, and particularly her erudite dissertations on the philosophy of Garveyism. Clearly, one who writes erudite dissertations is hardly the literary dilettante that Martin describes. Finally, in a 1971 Ebony article, Amy Jacques Garvey is described as still carrying out Marcus's work from her home in Jamaica by doing extensive research and documentation for scholars and professors worldwide. Over 30 years after Marcus's death, Amy's work does not stand on its own merit, according to these accounts. And that's a crazy thing about history, right? And there's a name for it. Every time I talk about it on this show, I cannot remember the name for it. But you would say Marcus Garvey was a long time ago, right? But you don't understand that Marcus Garvey died early, died young. And his wife, right, was still around in the early 70s, early to mid 70s, right? When folks like myself were born. So when you look at, and I always think about this in terms of the human race, right? Like, we haven't really been doing a lot for a very long time. When you think about a car is about just over 100 years old, right? So the point I'm trying to get at is Garvey is really not that long ago when you think about it, right? I just had it for a second, but the term I'm missing is these history handholders or something. There was someone there was a, how to go again? There was a relative of Lincoln's who died like in 1950 something. I think like a sibling or something. But when you look at what it was something like Lincoln's father had children really late in life, like almost near death. And so this baby was born, and the baby lived. This child lived for almost 100 years themselves, or something of that nature. And so, in essence, like time is something that's very funny, right? It doesn't. Time might seem long in one perspective, but in another, it's not long. That's really what I'm trying to get across here. I have my water now. When I do these podcasts, for some reason, I'm thirsty as hell. When I teach a lab and I'm talking for similar lengths of time, I don't feel all this thirst. Why? The various articles written about Amy Garvey focus primarily on her reminiscences about Marcus's life and activities. One of the few articles ever written that specifically addresses Amy Garvey and her work appeared over 10 years ago in the journal Black Scholar, Matthews, 1979. Matthews claims that Amy Garvey is one of the most remarkable women in history, and he laments the fact that she has never been mentioned in articles on black women, or any other subject for that matter. Matthews criticizes the minimization of black women like Amy Garvey in the Garvey movement, and argues that the movement had a profound impact on black women. What he does not say is that women like Amy Garvey also had an immeasurable effect on the Garvey movement and played an integral part in its shaping. So, this is not very uncommon that, the role of women in organizations kind of reflected the role of women in society at the time. And it's for us to actively work against that, to actively change that, right? We need to uplift our women more. And some of you women ain't gonna like this, but a lot of you need to uplift yourselves too, right? And to be considerably more worthy. I was listening to an episode of the Pro-Black Perspective earlier today. Two episodes. I listened to the live worship, and then I listened to, and you guys should be tuning into the Sunday worship of the Pro-Black Perspective. Always good stuff. But I was listening to another episode that only did a couple of days back that I missed when he went live, and he was talking about his whole organization. And during the conversation, he mentioned something that was really disheartening to me, even though I kind of know that it's the case. How, I forget who it was, but a woman wrote in her book how black women are secretly sleeping with white men all the time. Like at alarming rates type stuff. And I know that there's truth in that, but just to hear it is so disappointing. Because I can remember knowing some, what you would call from the outside, from the exterior, as conscious women, right? Back in my days, closer to my college days, who were conscious women, and they had all the paraphernalia, they had the look, they had the locks, and all that kind of stuff. They had the natural hair, they had RBG or red, gold, and green, or whatever the little symbols are, they had it. And behind the scenes, man, they were cupcaking out here with some white boys. Or had been cupcaking with some white boys in their recent past. Or quietly would be willing to cupcake with a white boy. I went to a meeting a little while ago of an organization. I won't call the name of the organization. I went to a meeting, and I'm sitting there, and they were screening a documentary, I Am a Man. Yeah, I Am a Man. And in front of me was a black woman with a, you know, with an Indian guy, which I consider white anyway. And I'm sitting there and, I'm trying to watch this film and I'm like, oh, who the fuck, who brought this dude here? And why? But that's a thing that happens a lot more than we think, right? Even among sisters who, it happens a lot in the general female population, but even among sisters we think are conscious. Some of y'all are out here eating white meat. You feel what I'm saying? So you guys too need to bring it up, right? But definitely men. Us men, if you're conscious and you're around organizations, you gotta include the women. You gotta include their voices, and they shouldn't be, outshone so badly that someone has to excavate later on to kind of bring up their name again. Anyway, growing up in Jamaica, Amy Jacques Garvey was born in Jamaica in 1896. A brief account of her life prior to meeting Marcus revealed the makings of an independent-minded, strong-willed, and highly talented woman. The social circumstances in which Amy lived influenced her views toward black nationalism, feminism, and class politics. She was apparently raised in a middle-class home with bourgeoisie Victorian values. She was taught to play the piano because music and music appreciation were considered the cultural finishing to a girl's education. Amy attended high school during a time when less than 2% of Jamaican youth received a high school education. As the eldest child in her family, Amy was obliged to read foreign newspapers and periodicals with her father in order to enhance her knowledge of the world. In this way, she absorbed her father's deep interest in political issues, including racial progress. And what I will add here is, don't overlook men. Men, don't overlook what it is to be a father to a girl or young woman. Don't overlook how important that is. Right? Father was progressive. Amy's father was progressive. And he raised her up in a certain way. And this is again what I talk about, like with curriculum and education and all this stuff. Like, you have some work to do at home as well. I get it. Not everyone can homeschool their children. It's a blessing if you can. I remember in college a kid telling me he was homeschooled until he graduated high school or until he reached high school. I'm like, homeschool? You could keep a child home and teach them at home like that? He's like, yeah, my mom did it. And his mom was a Rastafarian. And not everyone can do that though. Right? And so I get it. You might have to send your kids out here to the public school system. Or only to say it was in the public school system, right? But you have to send them out there understanding that there's a miseducation that goes on there. And so at home, you need to be doing things that keeps that black child centered and develops them in a way where they can be a true gift to their community and to their race overall. And so, guys, and girls, but man, this is what you want to be doing with your children, right? You want to challenge them, right? To be more and to understand more about the world around them. You know, a lot of what I talk about is about nature and manipulating nature around you and solving problems around you and understanding what's going on around you in general. And that's what the father of Amy Garvey did here. To continue. Like many middle-class women of her generation, white and black, Amy Jacques Garvey was reared to be well-educated and socially conscious during an era of constricted career opportunities for women, particularly black women. But Amy, as for her middle class, educated peers interested in social change, social reform work, was among the few viable means for advancing her social and political agenda. Her middle class status allowed her to develop the verbal and intellectual skills necessary for becoming an effective movement leader. And I like this little paragraph here because, again, if you want to talk about what you're going to do in terms of raising up the next generation, this is the kind of stuff you need to be doing, right? You want your children to be well educated and socially conscious. Not just well educated, quote unquote, by the public school system, but you're supposed to be setting an education at home for your children. Because, as it was in Amy's day, it still kind of is now. You know, I mean, there's more career opportunities, but there's still a constricted career opportunity situation going on for women, particularly black women, and for black men too. Right? So what they did, as it says here, for Amy, as for her middle class, educated peers interested in social change, social reform work, was among the few viable means for advancing her social and political agenda. So what you want to do is create this individual, this child, male or female, who is educated and socially conscious, and they could find career opportunities in that arena, in the social and political arena, right? That's what you want to do. And once they have the proper verbiage, they have the proper intellect, they'll excel. And they can become leaders themselves. And that's one of the things that's kind of missing. We don't have those, did I hear talking about that recently? We don't have like those finishing schools anymore, right? So we have to be it now. We have to do it at home, okay? But we need to be, if we want to have more female leadership, we have to groom more females for leadership. And so this little passage right here is something to keep in mind if you have daughters. This is what you want to keep in mind. Groom them to be leaders. And in this way, they can't, especially in this present day, they can't be overlooked now, right? To continue. Amy seemed to be fascinated by the United States, evidenced in her decision to move there as a young woman. Her childhood, at the turn of the century, coincided with a period of intensified bigotry and discrimination against black Americans. Entrenched segregation, political disenfranchisement, and mob violence against black Americans characterized this area, described as the nadir in U.S. race relations. Recognizing that dependence on white society was tantamount to race suicide, and this is what you guys are not understanding, right? You guys are not understanding this fundamental concept. Dependence on white society is tantamount to race suicide. You depend on the people who don't like you, right? Who don't care for you. It's racial suicide. God damn. Black Americans, still concentrated in the South, developed their own social, political, and economic infrastructure in an effort to secure racial progress. This philosophy of self-help, race pride, and economic autonomy that pervaded the black community during the early 20th century undoubtedly influenced Amy's development as a black nationalist and advocate of economic self-sufficiency for blacks. Now, let me ask you just a quick question here. Amy came here early 1900s. right? Did ADOS or FBA work to get her over here? Early 1900s. Did ADOS or FBA work to get? So that's why when I hear that talking point all the time, I'm like, what are these folks talking about? Amy was exposed to race consciousness in Jamaica. During the late 19th century, most black Jamaicans were poor, illiterate peasant farmers. Well, were poor, illiterate peasant farmers, right? At the time, Europe's colonization of Africa led many African-born Jamaicans to develop a sense of African consciousness. Some Jamaicans returned to Africa, while many others spoke out in Africa's defense. This nationalistic fervor spread throughout the West Indies and contributed to the development of the first Pan-African Conference in London in 1900. In 1914, Marcus Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement and Conservation Association and African Communities League in Jamaica, the precursor to the U.N.I.A. This nascent nationalism in Jamaica must have affected Amy Garvey's burgeoning race consciousness as a young woman. So that's the thing too to mention. Like, Amy was younger than Garvey, if my memory serves me correct, right? And she also lived longer than him too. Amy was influenced by other factors as well. As a girl, she received mixed messages from her father about her place in life. While he encouraged her intellectual development, he also constrained her career options. In high school, Amy appealed to her father to allow her to take shorthand and typewriting courses. He agreed to let her learn them, however, only as a means to take notes in her training to become a nurse. It appears that Amy had minimal say in her father's plans for her, and her father expected her to follow those plans. Amy managed to finish her typing and shorthand courses and win a prize for her outstanding performance. Shortly thereafter, she was offered an entry-level position in the legal firm to which her teacher was connected. Her father, however, barred her from taking the job, claiming that he did not want any daughter of mine to be exposed to the wiles of men in an office. Her father apparently believed that such work was inappropriate for a proper lady. Well, what the author is not saying is that, a lot of folks are captive of the time that they're in. Can you or I say that Amy Garvey's father was wrong in that time that he lived in and in that place? Right? Sorry about that. Can we say that he was wrong? Right? That time, that place, and there's all sorts of factors of how he grew up, etc., how he was raised. Can we say he was wrong? But the authors won't discuss that because the idea is to push the black feminist angle as well. As fate would have it, Amy's father died suddenly of a stroke at this time. As fate would have it. That's an interesting wording. Died suddenly of a stroke at this time. In response, the family's lawyer suggested to her mother that Amy work in his office as a clerk to oversee her father's estate. Her mother agreed, and Amy worked in the law office for 4 years, becoming knowledgeable about law to the point that she could attend to every legal phase of the work. Out of the tragedy of her father's death, Amy gained the opportunity to pursue avenues that he had closed to her. Significantly, her relationship with her domineering father was reenacted in her marriage to Marcus. Her experience of sexism within the family, in the workplace, and later in the Garvey movement contributed to her development as a feminist. This feminist consciousness was likely already blossoming when, after 4 years at the law office, Amy decided to go to the United States against the will of her mother and her employer. Amy left for the United States in 1918. So 1918 is when she came to the States. Who brought her here? promising to return in 3 months if conditions proved to be unbearable. She claimed that her primary reasons for going were to further her education and to see the land of opportunity and limitations, according to my father's description. And that's that's what the immigrant hears when they think of the U.S. I mentioned it before on social media. Not every immigrant, and in fact, I've mentioned on this show too, in one of my rants. Not every immigrant comes to the States because their country is quote unquote effed up. The U.S. is a place, because of how it's been constructed, it's a place that has a lot of opportunities, both large and small. And it's about how now it's harder to get into large opportunities as a black person, we all know that. But there are opportunities. And how you work it is how you work it, right? And so people come here really because there's more opportunity. When I see people from my hometown, they always tell me when I say stuff like, man, I be thinking about coming back. And they're like, come back for what? Ain't nothing going on home now. You see? And so you want to be in a place where when one door closes, another one opens. Or there's another one already open somewhere. And a lot of these countries, a large part because of colonialism, because of what America has done to the region, all these places don't have all those open doors if a door closes on you. So you can see real hard times in some third world countries, right? And so that's why people come to the States, right? Opportunity and limitations. And this was before any civil rights movement when Amy came here. And already it was seen as a land of opportunity. And this is only maybe probably less than 60 years after, this is less than 60 years after emancipation. So this is why I want people, especially with this new ADOS and FBA stuff, I want people to really understand what was going on here. And to be realistic about what you should take credit for, what you should not take credit for. Amy did not return to Jamaica in 3 months, and her life was to take a major turn shortly after her arrival in the United States. By defying her family's wishes and going to a foreign country alone, when this was an anomaly for most women, I was going to say that too. This was real out there, but this points to something larger that I've talked about before. Is that success favors the bold. Success favors the bold. And sometimes, even today, I still have to remind myself that success favors the bold. Like sometimes you gotta get out of where you are, get out from where you are or from where you're from to really find the treasures out there, right? To really find where your lane is for optimal success. And so when I was reading through this earlier, in my mind, I was saying, damn, she really left in that time, 1914, right? Early 1900s, she left Jamaica alone and came to the States. That alone is low-key remarkable. Right? Amy demonstrated independence of mind, courage, and thirst for knowledge, all of which characterized her for the rest of her life. Now we get to the section, Amy Jacques meets Marcus Garvey. Not long after arriving in New York, Amy heard a great deal about the U.N.I.A., then headquartered in New York City. Given conflicting reports about the organization, she decided to attend a meeting at Liberty Hall one summer evening in 1919. Marcus gave a speech that night, and Amy allegedly went up to him afterward to congratulate him on his fine oratory and to ask him questions. Because there were many points that she believed he did not address, Amy claimed that she did this to be convinced of Marcus's righteousness and to test her ability to argue on my conviction. Marcus's answers evoked more questions from Amy, and they agreed to meet again at his office to talk more about Garveyism. This man was running game here, boy. Okay. cupcaking. Amy's self-initiated introduction to Marcus, already a famous man, reveals her to have been an assertive, self-confident woman. And that's what we need, man. You don't need loud mouths out here. You need assertive, self-confident women. And I did an episode talking about what brings up the self-esteem or the self-confidence of black women, right? Being immersed early on in black nationalism, in consciousness, right? With eagerness. So anytime you read about a woman who was raised a certain way, like was conscious, was progressive, was self-aware, you always notice that they have these kind of lives to them. These kind of bold, adventurous, intelligent lives. So keep that in mind when you're raising your daughters. Her eagerness to engage Marcus in dialogue suggests that she had already developed ideas regarding the race issue. The details surrounding Amy Jaquez's courtship and marriage to Marcus are ambiguous and full of contradictions. It is unclear whether or not Amy Jaquez and Marcus began their romance during Marcus's marriage to Amy Ashwood. Ashwood claimed that she left Marcus in the summer of 1921 after a period of separation when she discovered that Marcus and Amy Jaquez, at that point his private secretary, were living together. Amy Jaquez claimed, however, that her romance with Marcus began only after he decided to divorce Amy Ashwood. I mean, should I break that down, boy? Anytime a woman tell you only after that. Anyway, I'll just leave that. Either way, while Amy Ashwood was away in England in June 1922, Marcus received a divorce from her in Kansas City without her knowledge. He then later married Amy Jaquez 1 month later on July 27, 1922 in Baltimore. Upon return from England, Amy Ashwood filed a countersuit denying the validity of the divorce and named Amy Jaquez as the correspondent. Her efforts to nullify the divorce failed. So I gotta be honest with y'all here. So here, and I don't have a problem with the reporting of history, obviously. But to me, when you bring up certain things and certain conversations, I gotta question why you're bringing it up. So, I understand this is probably a black woman writer, a black feminist, but you ain't gotta try and make the black man look like a a-hole here. You know what I mean? But anyway, while the facts are muddled, one can surmise that Marcus behaved less than sincerely in his dealings with Amy Ashwood and Amy Jaquez. But see, at the same time, you could say Amy Jaquez was also. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. You could say, again, let me leave that up. These two women had been best friends as teens in Jamaica, and Amy Jaquez had been Amy Ashwood's chief bridesmaid at her wedding to Marcus. Fortunately, this long-term friendship was greatly damaged, if not severed, by the struggle over Marcus. But this author is making it seem like Marcus is, like he's the asshole. Where are we right now? Okay, let's take a quick station ID break.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. Make sure to support all those shows on KWAZ Radio. Make sure to follow KWAZ Radio on social media and follow all the other shows that provide content on the podcast network. That would be greatly appreciated. So back to the reading. early life with Marcus. Amy's relationship with Marcus, at least in the beginning, was founded on mutual respect and admiration. She respected his creative genius, her intellectual prowess. Okay, so I hate when they write like that. So she respected his creative genius, and he respected her intellectual prowess. Their correspondence reflects a shared, profound understanding based on a genuine exchange of ideas. Few people, including Garveyites, were ever able to establish the intimate rapport with Marcus that Amy did. Marcus was apparently very difficult to get along with and was considered by many to be short-tempered, unpredictable, unpredictable. Yeah, I had to take a look out the window. Some kids doing some stuff outside. I don't like people around my window. Um, so like I was saying, Marcus was apparently very difficult to get along with and was considered by many to be short-tempered, unpredictable, and suspicious. While Amy showed him respect, he was also, unlike most, tough enough to talk back to him. Early in their relationship, Amy was one of Marcus's staunchest supporters and portrayed herself publicly as his companion and helpmate. In March 1923, shortly before Amy published her first volume of The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, a compilation of Marcus's writings and speeches, Amy was interviewed by the Negro World regarding her forthcoming book. When asked what occupied her thoughts most, Amy responded, my husband. She went on to say that Marcus's work was his whole life. Knowing this, I endeavored to be conversant with subjects that would help in his career and try to make home a haven of rest and comfort for him. Right. A little distracted by the noise coming from outside. Anyway, Amy edited Volume 1 of the Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey only 7 months after she married Marcus. Her initial purpose was not to publish, but rather to keep a personal record of Marcus's opinions and sayings. She eventually decided to produce the book so that the public could cultivate opinions about Marcus based on his words versus the misleading, biased material propagated by the media. By the time Amy decided to publish, Marcus had already been indicted for mail fraud and had countless enemies determined to undermine him. Convinced of her husband's righteousness, Amy was determined to exonerate him through her book. Moreover, she believed that by disseminating of the truth, blacks would be inclined to action. By the spread of the gospel, Negroes the world over may be informed and inspired for truth brought to light, forces conviction, and a state of conviction inspires action. While Marcus was perpetually assaulted by his enemies and often betrayed by his friends, Amy defended him through it all and remained a proponent of Garveyism for the rest of her life. A vital player in the Garvey movement. While Amy may genuinely have believed at first that her primary role was as Marcus's comforter, she did not remain in that role for very long and quickly became a central force in the Garvey movement. Amy's place in the movement became, according to one author, second only to Marcus in the U.N.I.A. Perhaps instead she should be considered first alongside Marcus. In Garvey and Garveyism, Amy claimed that a significant portion of the speeches, writing, and even thought of Marcus was the result of her efforts. She described how Marcus asked her to read through magazines and newspapers for important articles and then explain their content and significance to him. He would in turn use this material as the basis for his speeches and front page articles and would seek Amy's opinions before going to press. He also incorporated information I'm sorry, I'm losing track because of all this stuff going on outside. He also incorporated information from Amy's own articles in the Negro World into his speeches. Amy clearly had a profound impact on Marcus's thought and was undoubtedly a co-creator, if not the creator, of aspects of Garveyite philosophy. Yeah, okay. Amy taught extensively with and without Marcus when he was in jail and was considered to be an excellent speaker. After the Garveys returned from a Western tour, Marcus was scheduled to speak in New York. While Amy was not on the program, a previous article series had created such a stir that the audience clapped and chanted, "We want Mrs. Garvey." After Amy spoke, Marcus took the podium and allegedly said with a smile, "Now I have a rival, but I am glad she is my wife." One wonders if Marcus was partly serious when he made this remark. He may have been genuinely threatened by the prospect of his wife sharing, if not overtaking, his role as the leader of the Garvey movement. This is where the black feminist stuff starts, that kind of man-hate shit starts to come in. Because you don't know what he was thinking. Why even put that out there, right? Why even put that out there? Marcus seemed extremely ambivalent about Amy's and even women's role in the movement. While he overtly advocated women's participation in Garveyism and strongly relied on Amy for intellectual and emotional support, he clearly viewed her as an aid in his work. This is evident in a message he sent to his supporters in the Negro world while he was in Toombs prison in 1923. "I commend to your care and attention my wife, who has been my helpmate and inspiration for years. Her tale of woe has not been told, but I feel sure that a day will come when the whole world will know the story of her noble sacrifice for the cause I love so much." So, right here I have to pause. What is the issue really with your woman or women, our women being our helpmates in the struggle? If you could answer that question honestly for me, please answer that in the comment section. Like, what is the issue with women being our equal and our equals and helpers, right, in the struggle? In our struggle against these white folks, we struggle against the white male who his helpmate is his white woman. So why is it all this issue? And he clearly states here how invaluable Amy was to him and the movement. I just don't get that sometimes. Despite this public plea on behalf of his wife, Marcus failed to show Amy his appreciation for her efforts. Huh? He expected self-sacrificing behavior from his wife, and perhaps was threatened by her rival status. You see when you start using perhaps and all that type of stuff, you're grabbing at straws now, right? Rendering him unable to acknowledge her capabilities and accomplishments. In the end, Amy never posed a threat to Marcus' leadership, and Marcus played an active part in ensuring the fact. Amy's relationship with Marcus mirrors many women's experience in the Garvey movement. While the U.N.I.A. espoused equal rights for women, U.N.I.A. women often claim that they were unfairly relegated to the position of supporting roles in the organization. This was one of the grievances they aired at the U.N.I.A.'s International Convention in 1922. Despite the U.N.I.A.'s theoretical commitment to sexual equality, sexism appeared to thrive within its ranks. Yet, like Amy Jacques Garvey, U.N.I.A. women managed to find their niches within the movement and render invaluable services to it. Another question, is that a problem for you guys? Right? Is it a problem that, okay, maybe women weren't given, that in-your-face, the in-your-face leadership roles, right? But they still, because you can't stop greatness, right? They still found their niche within the movement and proved to be invaluable. Is that problematic to you? Right? Should we look at it differently these days? I mean, I'm sure we should look at it differently, but if it was to happen today, would it be so problematic? Again, when you struggle against these white boys, who are aided by their women, but no nation puts women out in front like that. Before I get hit with the sexist title, let me just move on here, right? So, the unofficial leader of the U.N.I.A. Because of unexpected circumstances, Amy eventually moved to center stage within the U.N.I.A. On June 21st, 1923, less than a year after Amy married Marcus, Marcus was convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Marcus spent 3 months in Tombs prison in upstate New York and was released on bond. When he failed to win any of his appeals, he was sent to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary on February 8, 1925, to serve a 5-year sentence. While authors claim that Amy became Marcus's personal representative and principal lieutenant during his imprisonment, one can easily argue that she became the U.N.I.A. leader during this time. It is virtually impossible to measure the amount of work that Amy accomplished during this period. In addition to speaking all over the country to raise money for Marcus's defense fund, Amy met constantly with officials and U.N.I.A. officers, organized U.N.A. conferences and affairs, was associate editor of the Negro World and editor of its woman's page, for which she wrote regular articles and editorials, worked tirelessly with lawyers to get Marcus released from jail, compiled and published Volume 2 of the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, as well as 2 volumes of Marcus's poetry, The Tragedy of White Injustice, and selections from the Poetic Meditations of Marcus Garvey, and visited Marcus almost every 3 weeks in Atlanta. Despite her Herculean efforts, Amy apparently never received from Marcus the appreciation she thought she deserved. That she never became the official leader of the U.N.I.A. during Marcus's imprisonment is due largely to the fact that Marcus prohibited it. At one point during Amy's unofficial tenure, some U.N.I.A. officers and branch members asked Marcus if they could call an emergency convention to to vote Amy in as the assistant president general in an effort to save the organization's dwindling assets. Marcus refused, praying that if Amy were ensnared by their enemies, he would then be left to rot in jail. Marcus relied on Amy's emotional support and tactical ingenuity for his well-being. His decision to inhibit her growth in the U.N.I.A. was based primarily on selfish reasons as far as he was concerned. Amy's main role in life was to save him. Now, for those of you who are studied or well studied on Marcus Garvey, did you get this impression of Garvey in his relationship to Amy Jacques Garvey? Right? Did you get the impression that he inhibited her growth so that he could live? Right? So that he could survive. If you did, please hit me a comment and cite your references. Next section, a troubled marriage. Garvey and Garveyism. Amy's initially laudatory tone toward Marcus is transformed into an outright anger and resentment as the book progresses. At points, she is wholly unabashed in her feelings about Marcus's flagrant disregard for her well-being. Marcus was released from prison and deported to Jamaica in November 1927. Shortly after Amy and Marcus settled in Jamaica, Marcus decided to go on a tour to England. Still reeling from previous events, Amy reluctantly joined him as his secretary. This appeared to be more than Amy could take, and in Garvey and Garveyism, she expressed hurt and outrage over feeling abused and manipulated by her selfish and callous husband. The excerpt says, his attitude toward his 11 years of struggle in America, particularly his imprisonment and all the suffering they caused us, were brushed aside as past history. He turned the pages of his life as an avid reader turns the pages of an adventure story and loses interest in the early chapters after reading them. Those who get hurt in tense moments of the adventure are only regarded as necessary props to the build-up of the hero. He was quite as impersonal in this regard as any reader. So I'm not here to cape for Garvey per se, but I will say that if you go back to those times, you go back to my grandfather's times, and even to some extent my father's times, that's how these folks operated. For better or for worse. That's how these folks operate. Those guys, didn't really consider too much outside of themselves and other men, right? That's just how it was. I'm not saying it was right. I'm not saying I'm not even saying it was wrong. It's just they were prisoners of their moment. They were captives of their day. And my point in saying that is to say, and I'm saying this about the author, and I'm even saying this about the ancestor Amy Garvey, that you have to be honest about the time that you were in, right? It's something we always have to consider. We have to consider the times that folks are in. Whenever we're giving a critique of a person, you have to consider the time and place, the context, right, for where that person was at. And to kind of not observe it, right, to make it seem like they were doing something completely contrary to everyone else. I think that's in violation. I think you can make those earnest complaints and then say, look, the man was, he was just like all the other guys around at the time. Because I heard my uncle say that one time with my grandfather. You know, my grandfather, when he was a younger man, you know, he, and I think of my grandfather as one of the greatest people I've ever known. Well, when he was a younger man, you know, he was a harsh husband. And I heard my uncle, my cousin was telling me that my uncle told him, yeah, he was a harsh man, but to be fair, you know, he wasn't the only one who was harsh at the time. And to me, that's a fair critique. That's a fair and honest critique. You can say a person was this, that, and the other, but to be honest, most of the people at the time was doing it, right? Amy was fully aware of the fact that from Marcus's point of view, she took a backseat to the movement. While she was committed to the movement as Marcus was, she did not believe that this commitment need be at the expense of emotional intimacy. In pages of Garvey and Garveyism, she shows that her emotional needs were far from fulfilled in her relationship with Marcus Garvey. And when Onitase was talking about this book, you know, he did on social media, on Twitter, he did mention, you know, Marcus wasn't easy, right? But I'll also point out, you know, again, this shows you something about the times, right? MLK wasn't easy either. And I'm not saying Marcus was right because MLK did it too. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just trying to give you context, time and place that these gentlemen were in. I mean, MLK had his wife and them out here alone almost. While he had a gun in his hip pocket, in his hip, in his waist, you know, his family was home unprotected. Look it up. You know? And me and a friend of mine have talked about this in the past. Like, MLK was so popular at one time worldwide. He could have sent his family to the continent somewhere, right? Somewhere that was independent, right? He could have sent them there and, you know, to be protected, right? Like, he had that ability to do it, and MLK was about the movement. You know, so again, I'm not saying for better or for worse, right or wrong. I'm just giving you the context of these gentlemen in this time, right? In this place and time. Indeed, as a feminist, Amy had extreme difficulty in reconciling her relationship with Marcus. At times, she resorted to rationalizations of his behavior, as in the beginning of Garvey and Garveyism, where she depicted Marcus as someone with a divine calling and with virtually no control over his behaviors or actions. Heredity and environment seemed to influence them and used by them to carry out a spiritual urge in a given line. They seemed to have a supreme purpose in life, and once started, even against personal interests, will not give up. They are, as it were, impelled to go on, even to death. And that's the, you know, that's not uncommon with leaders, especially leaders who are leading a given line like this one, right? Like a revolutionary cause. Like, the work is huge to them. It's everything, actually. And the way those guys judge and interact with others is based on their relationship to the work, to the movement. And you would see that today, actually. You could go into like a Fortune 500 and watch a CEO, you know, one of these dudes making a ridiculous amount of money per year, right? They are super focused on the work. And you, as a friend or spouse or even children, have to get in where you fit in. And I know it's tough to hear, but hey, let me explain something to you. When you're leading certain types of work, all of these other things like relationships and whatnot are distractions. Now, I don't like to think about or talk about that stuff, but it's real. Those guys, and like I was telling my students recently, like the guys who call themselves the baby boomers, for example, they grow up on this similar kind of principle. Once they're doing their work, they're doing their work. They ain't care about throwing no baseball or no shit back and forth with you. When you watch these movies and TV shows and you see they depict like a father goes out for cigarettes one day and never returns, they're talking about these kind of guys. They're talking about guys from this time, born in this time or alive and well flourishing in this time. They're talking about people from this time. And that's something where, you cannot police someone's emotions. So I feel it for Amy Garvey. You can't police her emotions and tell her, well, she should have put up and shut up. Nah, she has feelings. She has feelings, but she has to also recognize that he wasn't alone. It's kind of the thing of the day. It's kind of how those guys operated. Just like those women operate a certain way too. Which is another thing. Like, a lot of women today will criticize, after reading this or hearing this episode of the podcast, they'll criticize a guy and try to kind of demote him, right? But because of how he made Amy feel. But both Amy's had that too. But like, you're not measuring yourself against who Amy Jacques Garvey was either. So you want to clown Garvey for his actions, but you're not measuring up at all to Amy either. You see, it's two sides of the sword. Are you being the kind of woman that Amy Garvey was? No. And you guys live in this time where you have more latitude to be and to do whatever you want to do. While this may be true about Marcus, it also reveals Amy's need to explain Marcus's behavior to herself. Beyond placating the emotional turmoil of living with a sexist, self-absorbed, and neglectful husband, I was waiting for this part to come. I was waiting for words like that to come up. Amy may have needed to assuage her own disappointment or shame over having settled for such an unfulfilling relationship. So that leads to another question. Well, maybe I'll forego that question. Her feminist consciousness was likely fueled by and became more fully articulated through her relationship with Marcus. Amy's feminist thought was further honed through her writings in the Negro World, the major Garveyite newspaper and most sophisticated black paper during the Harlem Renaissance. Black Women and Reform. Let's see how much time we have here. Black Women and Reform. You know what? Let me do a station ID. I'll be right back.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Welcome back to the Bit of Medicine podcast. I'm going to read just one more section, and I'm going to wrap this episode up, and I'll continue it in the next episode. So let's just do this. Black women and reform. Amy Jacques Garvey's social activism and writings in the Negro world reflect a long-standing tradition among black women in this country to advance racial, gender, and class equality. Although black women like Amy historically worked within movements for racial progress, this hardly meant that they were unconscious of gender and class oppression. On the contrary, black women were highly attuned to the overlapping effects of racism, sexism, and classism on their lives. What Deborah King in 1998 calls multiple jeopardy, black women addressed issues of race, gender, and class within the context of uniracial organizations, largely because of racial discrimination in the white women's movement, special problems that black women face, including widespread charges of immorality and depravity, and the ascendancy of the race consciousness self-help philosophy among black Americans during the late 19th century. Because racism, sexism, and classism have always operated as interdependent control systems in the lives of black women, black female reformers have historically treated these issues as inextricably linked in their work. Like her counterparts in the club movement, Amy Jacques Garvey believed that poverty, poor health conditions, child welfare, mob violence, and racial segregation were women's issues as much as women's suffrage and women's higher education were strategies for racial advancement. Consistently, the legacy of economic deprivation among black Americans means that most movements for racial progress, including Garveyism, incorporated programs for economic equality. As a Garveyite, Amy Jacques Garvey's racial and class politics were more radical than those of other contemporary black reformers, male and female. The racial uplift movement of the early 20th century was led primarily by middle-class blacks who advocated equality and upward mobility for black Americans within the existing social order. Many movement leaders, including black club women, strove to instill a sense of middle-class gentility in their poor brethren. The Garvey movement, however, catered primarily to urban working-class blacks and rebuked the bourgeoisie values of white society. In the belief that white racism was inevitable, Garveyites strove to establish an independent black society. The belief that white racism was inevitable, Garveyites strove to establish an independent black society. Significantly, Garveyism burgeoned during a period of Northern Fever, which is between 1916 and 1921, when an estimated 500,000 blacks migrated from southern plantations to northern urban industrial centers. By 1920, a total of 31% of black workers were employed in industry. The experiences of racism, classism, and sexism, in the case of black women, in the industrial sector rendered them the most exploited and alienated workers. Amy Jacques Garvey addressed the plight of black industrial workers in her writings. She revered Lenin, interestingly. Whom she devoted her first editorial in the Woman's Page for attempting to establish an egalitarian society based on non-exploitative social relations. I bet you Amy wouldn't have liked being married to Lenin either, by the way. Nevertheless, Amy's writings at times belied her middle-class origins. Presenting herself as an enlightened role model for the black community, Amy sometimes foisted her middle-class values onto her readers. For example, she unrealistically urged an overworked and underfed black populace to read daily in order to become interesting conversationalists and to be able to intelligently discuss other subjects besides the weather and football or prize fighting. Now here's the thing about that. You should always be striving to read. To learn, right? And to converse about ideas. In fact, being overworked and underfed should lead to more progressive conversation, right? So I get where Amy was coming from. Amy's condescension, however, was tempered by her profound recognition that as a black woman living in an intensely racist society, her fate was bound up with the black masses. Racial self-preservation, rather than a sense of noblesse oblige, motivated middle-class black women like Amy Jacques Garvey to embark on racial reform. In the effort to combat the multiple effects of racism and classism on the black community, Amy was more interested in addressing the fundamental needs of black Americans than in bestowing culture upon them. Interesting. The effort to combat the multiple effects of racism and classism on the black community, Amy was more interested in addressing the fundamental needs of black Americans than in bestowing culture upon them. So I'm going to end this episode here. This is going to be part 1. I'm going to drop part 2 later on. And we're going to pick up at this point our women and what they think. So I want to say, thank you for tuning in. I asked a bunch of questions during this reading. I gave a bunch of views. Do you agree with my views? Do you disagree? How do you respond to the questions I asked throughout? Make sure to leave a comment. Let me know. Even if you're listening on a podcast app, you could head on over to the YouTube page and leave your comments and thoughts on this episode. This is part 1. Part 2 should be coming soon. Make sure, again, to like, subscribe, hit the bell, share the content, talk to me about it, talk to your friends about it. Do all the things, right? Until next time, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.